So I too want to begin by acknowledging the territory of the Nanaimo people and thank them for allowing us to gather here today and this weekend. So my paper is titled Unsettling the Settlement Act, Land Conflict in the Past and Present on Vancouver Island, or alternatively, Why We Need to Study the ENN Land Grant, or Land Grab. If you're not familiar with the Settlement Act, you may know it by what it brought about, the Esquimalt and Nanaimo Railway, better known as the ENN to those here on Vancouver Island. My focus here is not, however, the 70-mile rail line, but rather the massive land grant or land grab that was given to the ENN Railway Company, led by coal magnate Robert Dunsmuir. The Settlement Act of 1883-1884, so called as it was intended to settle the question of the railway on Vancouver Island, is the provincial legislation that granted nearly 2 million acres to the Dominion government, who, in 1887, granted the lands to the ENN Railway Company. In this paper, I want to show that the Settlement Act is antecedent to specific and ongoing acts of territorial dispossession on Vancouver Island. I argue that the ENN land grant is not a single historical event that altered property relations on Vancouver Island, but that it is a fluid feature of settlement on Vancouver Island. That is, the grant is not a temporally fixed event. The boundaries of the grant have shifted over time, and the grant continues to have implications regarding the dispossession of unceded First Nation territories on Vancouver Island. I'll begin by explaining how the Settlement Act came about and how this provincial legislation created conflict between governments, settlers, and capital. I will then provide an overview of a few of the efforts made to resolve these conflicts. Finally, I conclude with some present-day examples that demonstrate the fluid and unsettled influence of the grant. First, let me situate this paper within the scholarship pertaining to the Settlement Act and the ENN land grant. This is fairly easy because there isn't too much written. With the exception of the studies you see up on the screen here, the Settlement Act and the ENN land grant and the conflict that ensued, which is what I'm going to focus on, have been given little attention. If the Settlement Act or grant are mentioned, it's only in passing as single events in line with the terms of union and the Dunsmuir Empire. By highlighting this lack of study and showing how the grant has shifted over time, I'm also challenging the self-evident understanding of the grant. In other words, I want to unsettle the idea that the grant and settler claims to First Nation territories were or are inevitable and complete. Unfortunately, I only have time here today to trace some of the conflict that emerged from the Act, but I hope to demonstrate that there is much more study that needs to be done, and that is something that I try to address in my PhD dissertation, and some of what follows is drawn from that larger project. So to understand the Settlement Act, it's necessary to begin at the terms of union between British Columbia and Canada in 1871. Canada offered to build a railway to the new province, as many of you probably know, and those in Victoria were eager to see the CPR, the Canadian Pacific Railway, cross over from the mainland at Seymour Narrows, Campbell River area, and terminate at the port of Esquimalt. This terminus seemed to be fixed by an 1873 order in council by the federal government. And shortly thereafter, the province reserved, quote, a strip of land 20 miles in width along the eastern coast of Vancouver Island between Seymour Narrows and the harbor of Esquimalt, end quote. Although these lands were set aside, it did not stop the arrival of settlers. Throughout the 1870s and the 1880s, settlers occupied lands throughout this railway reserve. In the terms of union with Canada, the railway was only required to make the seaboard of British Columbia. You can see it highlighted up there on the screen. And so Esquimalt was scrapped for the mainland in 1878, and Vancouver Island was awarded what some have called a consolation prize of the Island Railway. Now in August 1883, the ENN Railway Company, consisting of Robert Dunsmuir, coal magnate and MLA for Nanaimo, and American investors, received the contract to build the Island Line. For construction of just over 70 miles of track, the ENN Railway Company was granted nearly 2 million acres of Vancouver Island of unceded First Nations territories, $750,000, and with the exception of gold and silver, quote, the rights to all coal, oil, ores, stones, clay, marble, slate, mines, minerals, and substances whatsoever thereupon, and therein, and thereunder. So the primary function of the Settlement Act was to transfer these lands and associated surface and subsurface property rights to the Dominion, who, upon successful completion of the 70-mile rail line, would then transfer the lands to the ENN Railway Company. The Settlement Act was passed in December 1883, and lands were transferred to the Dominion in 1884. Recall that between 1873 and 1883, settlers continued to occupy these unsurveyed railway reserve lands. And these settlers were under the impression that once the railway question was settled, they would be permitted to purchase the lands that they had occupied. 10 years of inaction on the railway by the federal government, combined with various legislative acts intended to spur the Dominion into starting construction on the railway, as well as land acts intended also to attract settlers, caused further confusion among many about what the status of these settler-occupied railway reserve lands was. So in the Settlement Act of 1883, the province attempted to account for the presence of these settlers with the following clause in the Act. Any bona fide squatter who has continuously occupied and improved any of the lands within the tract of land to be acquired by the company from the Dominion government for a period of 1 year to the first day of January 1883 shall be entitled to a grant of the freehold of the surface rights of the said squatted land to the extent of 160 acres of each squatter at the rate of $1 an acre. Of significance to our discussion here today is that this clause does not grant these squatters title to fee simple land. That is, the right to subsurface minerals was excluded. So, while squatters were given the chance to buy lands that they had occupied, they were denied full fee simple title. As this exclusion became known, settler protests led to several attempts to rectify the matter. As I state, for example, no fewer than 10 legal cases stemming from the terms of the Settlement Act were brought forward to either the Supreme Court of Canada or the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council in London between 1894 and 1919. Given my time constraints here today, I won't go into depth into the various court cases and petitions that arose from the Settlement Act, but I do, however, want to briefly highlight the 3 commissions of inquiry and 1 attempted legislative fix that did result. As I stated earlier, the loss of fee simple title by the conveyance of subsurface mineral rights to the ENN was the main source of contention. Consider that much of the grant encompassed rich coal fields in the Nanaimo and the Comox regions, and that the ENN Railway Company was headed by a capitalist who made his wealth from coal. The ENN Railway, the possession of these subsurface rights by the ENN Railway Company had an influence on property values. As such, the number of settlers coming forward with claims to these rights forced the Dominion government to launch a commission of inquiry into the matter in 1897. The first commission found that although, quote, these settlers, speaking generally, have now no legal right to the coal and other minerals under the lands they or those claiming from them have a just claim for redress at the hands of the province in which they lie, and a claim which that province cannot honorably refuse to recognize and settle. Essentially, the commissioner noted that the province had failed to adequately inform the settlers that their occupation would be subject to the railway reserve set out in 1873. Therefore leading to the misunderstanding that their purchase or preemption would result in fee simple title. And of course, the federal government accepted no blame for this and basically told the province it was for them to deal with. Following from the Dominion's inquiry, which blamed the province of British Columbia, BC, of course, created its own commission of inquiry in 1900 to look into the matter. And the report, which was issued in 1901, absolved the province of any of the wrongdoing and rejected settler claims to full title or compensation. And you can see what they said there up on the screen. But by 1902, affected settlers had found a champion in Nanaimo MLA, J.H. Hawthornthwaite, who argued that their claims were, quote, just and should be, quote, settled with equity and fairness. Other provincial politicians seemed to agree, and in 1904, the Vancouver Island Settler Rights Act attempted to retroactively give certain settlers full title to E&N lands that they had occupied. The Act, the Settler Rights Act, returned fee simple title to those who, upon application to the government, could provide, quote, reasonable proof of such occupation or improvement and intention prior to 1883 within 1 year of the legislation. The matter, however, quickly encountered the pitfalls of Dominion-provincial relations. The E&N Railway Company applied to the federal government for disallowance of the Settler Rights Act, arguing that it was, quote, an unjust confiscation of the company's rights in the property. The Dominion agreed, and the act was disallowed by the federal government in June 1904. So, in 1905, the province made a second grant to the Dominion, which was then given to the railway company, of 86,346 acres. These were transferred to the Dominion for conveyance to the E&N, and it was intended to rectify the fact that the Settlement Act did not identify which lands within the E&N grant boundary had already been alienated. This is because much of the grant was not surveyed, and at the time the extent of these squatters was unknown. So, ruling on the case McGregor v. Esquimalt and Nanaimo Railway Company in 1907, the JCPC, the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council, agreed with the province that the grant to the Dominion did include parcels of fully alienated land. As a result, the disallowance by the federal government of the Settler Rights Act was reversed. So, to rectify the loss of rights stemming from the Settler Rights Act, yet another grant of 20,000 acres was made to the E&N in 1913. So now we're on the third grant. We can see here that the Great Land Grab, as it's been called by the Hull Community Treaty Group, is more than a single transfer of land. The terms of the Act led to years of conflictual claims to First Nations territories, while subsequent grants attempted to rectify any loss to the E&N Railway Company. Despite these settlements, court cases, and legislative fixes, in 1916, yet another provincial commission heard further requests from settlers for redress. In submissions to the Settler Rights Commission, settlers provided local knowledge and rudimentary maps to support their claims of occupation prior to 1883. For example, settlers offered some of the following testimony. This land was taken up about 1873 or 4 and was occupied about 1872 by a shoemaker by the name of Reddy, who lived there some years. We believe that J. Shields afterwards owned the property and sold to Samuel Fulton Crawford, afterwards purchased about 1905 by W.J. Andrews, and thence to present owners. Both Mr. Reddy and Mr. Shields are very well known by the old-timers here, such as Mr. McPhee, Mr. Urquhart, and others, and there is little difficulty in obtaining this history. In Ladysmith, another claimant focused on significant land use events to make their case. I will remember George Cassidy living on and improving Lot 8 Oyster District in the year 1881. In the said year 1881, I drove a team of oxen on the said Lot 8 Oyster District, which the said George Cassidy packed a plow on his back for the purpose of cultivating the said lands, which he afterwards did. This testimony resulted in yet another effort in 1917 to amend the 1904 Settler Rights Act to allow further claims to be made to the fee simple land. This time it was for those who had missed the 1-year window in 1904. This act in 1917 was disallowed by the Dominion, and this time disallowance was upheld. But what I want to focus on here is that in many ways these oral testimonies, these are also oral histories. Early settlers or descendants offering stories of their occupation prior to the act. The acceptance of oral histories as proof of occupation stands in stark contrast to BC and Canada's denial of oral history regarding Indigenous rights and title. The point I want to make here is that the Dominion and provincial governments went to great lengths to defend the property rights of both the ENN and individual settlers. Of course, this is not an unsurprising statement, given that both settler colonialism and capitalism demand the concept of private property. And that this idea of private property must be upheld at all costs. So the point here is to challenge the idea that the ENN land grant, or grants, is little more than a single historical event relegated to a past when land grants were the standard for provincial or nation building. We can begin to see that the Settlement Act did not actually settle anything. It only made the dispossession of Indigenous territories a more complex interplay between capital, settlers, and the state. To reinforce this argument, I want to touch on two recent and ongoing examples. To do so, it is necessary to return to the Dunsmuir family. The land grant contained vast forest resources, but the Dunsmuirs were not all that interested in timber. They made their money in coal, and that was their primary business. As such, in the 1890s, the ENN Railway Company began selling off large tracts of forest lands. In 1905, the ENN and the remaining lands were sold to the Canadian Pacific Railway Company. And today, what remains of the ENN land grant is now owned primarily by two forest companies, Timber West and Island Timberlands. These lands are private property as created by the land grant, and they are not Crown lands licensed to forest companies, as is the case across much of the rest of the province. Their status as private property and not Crown lands means that First Nations, such as those represented in the Hul'qumi'num Treaty Group, cannot negotiate for them in the modern British Columbia treaty process. Private property is off the table. What to do then when 84% of your traditional territory was gifted in a historic and illegal land grant? In 2007, the Hul'qumi'num Treaty Group submitted a petition to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, and at issue is Canada's violation of the American Declaration of the Rights and Duties of Man. And I'll show you a quote on that in a second, but I want to just show you here the resemblance of the private timberlands to the original ENN land grant. You can actually see the exact shape of the grant in this line here and the subsequent grants that followed. This is also a map of the territory of the Hul'qumi'num speaking peoples south of Nanaimo, and the light purple here is private property, ENN lands reserved by the Crown. Legal scholar Sarah Morales has shown that the Great Land Grab continues to have destructive effects for the Hul'qumi'num peoples. She writes, as these private lands became, quote, developed, fences and locked gates went up to block our entry to places where we'd always hunted, harvested plant food, and gathered other resources to meet material needs. For over a century, we've seen the natural wealth leave our territory, making others wealthy at our expense. The loss of these lands also affects our cultural life. We are prevented from using areas of great cultural importance, including bathing sites, burial grounds, and other special places. Many of these sites have been destroyed by development and are now lost to us forever. Given the vast holdings of these forestry companies, their interests extend beyond forestry. Real estate, the piecemeal sale of what remains of these lands, also contributes to their shareholder value. For example, in 2009, Timber West Forestry Company created a real estate division called Couverton, which sells properties deemed to be having a higher and better use, usually parcels with riverfront or scenic views. And so Timber West and Couverton have also been involved in proposing large developments, including in the outside of the town of Ladysmith and just outside of Campbell River, where they own lands. The point here is that capital and settlers continue to lay claim to and exploit the ENN grant lands. In 1897, 1901, 1916, it was through demands for full fee simple title and mineral rights. In 2017, it is through forestry, real estate development, and the purchase of private property. Each time a property is sold for development, it becomes one more step removed from possible restitution to First Nations. The ENN land grant has changed shape countless times over the last 130 years, but it continues to have locally specific and ongoing consequences. There's lots more to say on this, and I do address some of that in my dissertation, but I've tried here to trace the fluidity of the ENN land grant. The Settlement Act is antecedent to specific forms of ongoing and historical dispossession on Vancouver Island. In closing, I want to circle back to the lack of study relating to the Act and the grant, and the subsequent conflict. Because inattention to these events has helped make the Great Land Grab and its effects a largely invisible process among settlers. What I mean here is that relegating the ENN land grant to 1883, 1884, or 1887 fails to make known that the grant has been an ongoing feature of colonization every day since its inception. As a final example, to reinforce this point, the 2016 settlement of a specific claim by the Nanaimo First Nation is instructive. And this is an agreement that was reached for lands alienated as a result of the Settlement Act. And this demonstrates the importance of studying the Act and the grant. Hopefully, understanding the ways in which these events are ongoing can lead to a future where lands are returned to those from whom they were taken. Thank you.